The morning sun had barely broken through the dense clouds when Captain Jada Williams stepped into the airport, her polished black shoes clicking against the gleaming floor. She had done this countless times before, walked into terminals, checked in with the airline staff, and headed straight to the crew lounge before a flight. But today was different. Today, she wasn't in uniform. Dressed in a simple navy blazer and jeans, Jada carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience in the cockpit. At just 34, she had already made history as one of the youngest black female captains for a major airline, a dream she had chased since childhood. She had flown through raging storms, handled emergency landings, and trained countless new pilots. But none of that would matter in the next few minutes. As she approached the check-in counter, she offered a polite smile to the airline staff behind the desk. "Good morning," she said, sliding her employee badge onto the counter. "I'm just heading to the crew lounge before my flight." The agent, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, barely glanced at the badge before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but passengers need to wait outside before boarding begins." Jada blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm not a passenger. I'm crew." The woman let out a small sigh, her eyes scanning Jada's casual attire. "Ma'am, only authorized personnel are allowed beyond this point. You'll need to wait outside like everyone else." A slow wave of disbelief rolled over Jada. She had been in the aviation industry long enough to recognize what was happening. The hesitation, the dismissive tone, the way the agent hadn't even bothered to check her badge properly. She had seen this play out before, not just with herself but with other colleagues who didn't fit the expected image of a pilot. Keeping her voice steady, she reached into her bag and pulled out a second form of identification. Her official airline ID, complete with her title and credentials. "I'm Captain Williams. I have a flight today." The woman's expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed more annoyed. "Look, I don't have time for this. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with customer service." A flicker of frustration ignited in Jada's chest, but she kept her composure. Years of professionalism had trained her for moments like this. Moments when she had to choose between reacting emotionally or handling things with the grace she had always been taught to uphold. She took a deep breath, preparing to stand her ground, when a voice from behind the counter chimed in. "Is there a problem here?" A senior staff member had walked over, his sharp eyes darting between Jada and the agent. For a brief second, Jada thought the situation would be resolved. Maybe he would recognize her. Maybe he would step in and do the right thing. But instead, he barely glanced at her IDs before shaking his head. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside. We don't allow unauthorized individuals past security." And just like that, the weight of everything came crashing down. She wasn't just being mistaken for a passenger. She was being dismissed, disregarded. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Because in just a matter of minutes, the entire airline was about to face a reckoning they never saw coming. Jada stood still for a moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The words echoed in her mind, unauthorized individual. She had spent over a decade proving herself in an industry that often made her feel like she had to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. Yet here she was, standing in an airport she had flown out of countless times, being told she didn't belong. The senior staff member didn't even look at her again as he turned to the agent and muttered, "Call security if she doesn't move." Jada felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, a mix of frustration and exhaustion. This wasn't new. It had happened before in different ways. People assuming she was a flight attendant instead of a pilot, passengers looking surprised when she walked into the cockpit, colleagues making subtle remarks about whether she had enough experience for her position. She had always handled it with grace, choosing to let her skill and professionalism speak louder than anything else. But this time was different. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and with a steady hand, snapped a picture of the airline staff. Not to create a scene, not yet. But she wanted to remember this moment. She wanted proof of how easily she was dismissed. The agent's expression changed slightly when she noticed. "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't." Jada slipped her phone back into her pocket before she could finish. "I'd like to speak to the chief pilot on duty," she said, her voice calm but firm. The senior staff member let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Ma'am, I've already told you, you need to wait outside." Jada didn't move. "Then call security," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Because I'm not going anywhere until you do." For a moment, there was silence. A few passengers in line had started paying attention. Nearby, a flight attendant from another airline glanced over, her expression curious. Jada knew how this looked. A woman standing her ground, refusing to leave when she had been told to. But she also knew something else. She wasn't the one in the wrong. The agent hesitated before muttering something under her breath and picking up the phone. Jada waited, standing tall, her heart pounding but her expression unreadable. As she stood there, her mind drifted back to the beginning of her journey, the countless hours of training, the sacrifices she had made to get here. She thought about the first time she ever sat in a cockpit, the overwhelming feeling of power and freedom as she took control of the aircraft. She had worked for this, earned this. And yet, in moments like these, it felt like none of it mattered. She was still being judged by something other than her skills. The minutes dragged on before a voice called out from behind. "Captain Williams?" She turned to see another pilot approaching, a man she recognized from previous flights. Captain Mark Reynolds. He had been with the airline longer than she had, a respected senior pilot. "What's going on here?" he asked, glancing between Jada and the staff behind the counter. The agent immediately softened when she saw him. "Oh, Captain Reynolds, we had a bit of a mix-up. This woman—" "Captain," Jada corrected, her eyes never leaving hers. "Captain Williams." Reynolds frowned, then looked at her ID. The moment he realized what had happened, his face shifted. "Wait, you didn't recognize her?" he asked the staff. The agent hesitated. "She wasn't in uniform, and, I mean, we have strict security policies, and," her voice trailed off. Reynolds let out a sigh. "She's a senior pilot for this airline. She belongs here." The senior staff member finally spoke up, clearing his throat. "We were just trying to follow procedures." "We?" Jada shook her head, cutting him off. "No, you weren't." Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "If I looked different, if I fit the image you had in your head of what a pilot should look like, you wouldn't have questioned me. You would have checked my badge properly. You would have let me through without hesitation. But instead, you dismissed me. You refused to listen, even when I presented my credentials." The staff fell silent. Even Reynolds looked slightly uncomfortable. Jada took a deep breath, then turned to Reynolds. "I need to see the base manager. Now." Reynolds nodded. "I'll walk you there myself." As they moved through the terminal, Jada felt the weight of the moment pressing on her. This wasn't just about today. It wasn't even just about her. It was about every other person who had been doubted, dismissed, or treated like they didn't belong simply because of who they were. And as she walked through the airport she had flown out of hundreds of times, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not even close. Jada walked through the terminal with Reynolds beside her, her heartbeat steady but her mind racing. The situation was still sinking in. She had been doubted before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the sheer dismissal, the way she had been waved off like she was an inconvenience rather than a professional. Maybe it was the quiet exhaustion creeping up on her, the kind that came from years of fighting the same battles. As they reached the airline's operations office, Reynolds hesitated. "Look, Jada, I get it. That was bad. But you know how it is. Some people just—" She stopped walking and turned to him. "Some people just what?" he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. They don't expect pilots like you. She let the words hang between them. Pilots like you. It wasn't the first time she had heard something like that, but coming from a fellow captain, it stung in a way she hadn't expected. So, what do you think I should do? Let it go? Reynolds shook his head. No, I didn't say that. I've been with this airline a long time, and I've seen what happens when you push back too hard. Jada studied his face. He wasn't being malicious. If anything, he looked genuinely concerned. But that was the problem. People got used to this. They got used to ignoring the small things, brushing them off, making excuses. And eventually, the small things turned into big things. She didn't say another word as she pushed open the office door. Inside, the base manager, Tom Whitaker, sat behind his desk, flipping through paperwork. He was a no-nonsense kind of man, someone who prided himself on keeping operations smooth. When he looked up and saw her standing there, his brows furrowed. "Captain Williams," he said, setting down his pen. "What's going on?" Jada crossed her arms. "I was stopped at the check-in counter and told to wait outside because they didn't believe I was a pilot." Whitaker sighed, already looking tired. "That's unfortunate, but I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Jada felt her jaw tighten. A misunderstanding. That was the go-to excuse. A simple mistake. An honest error. But mistakes like this didn't happen to all pilots. "I presented my credentials," she said, keeping her voice measured. "Twice. And they still refused to let me through. They even threatened to call security." Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "I'll talk to the staff. Make sure they're more careful next time." Jada shook her head. "That's not enough." Whitaker studied her. "What do you want, Captain?" Jada took a breath. "I want accountability. I want to know why this keeps happening, not just to me, but to others. How many pilots have walked into this airport and never had to prove who they were? How many have been questioned, dismissed, and ignored?" Whitaker exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Jada, you're a great pilot. No one is questioning that." She let out a quiet laugh. "That's the problem, Tom. They are questioning it. Not because of my skills, not because of my record, but because of how I look. And it's not just about today. It's about a pattern." Whitaker tapped his fingers on the desk. "You want me to do what? Fire someone over this?" Jada held his gaze. "I want this company to acknowledge that bias exists here. I want real change. Training policies, something that prevents this from happening to the next person." Whitaker was silent for a moment. Then he let out a slow breath. "I'll see what I can do." Jada knew what that meant. It meant I'll let this fade away. It meant I don't want to deal with this. She had given him a chance to do the right thing. Now, it was up to him whether he took it. As she turned to leave, Reynolds followed her out. "Jada," he said quietly, "what are you planning to do?" She didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. And if the airline thought they could brush it under the rug, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Jada left the office without another word, her mind racing as she moved through the terminal. The buzz of passengers, the overhead announcements, the distant hum of jet engines, it all felt distant, like white noise behind the storm brewing inside her. She had given them a chance to do the right thing, to acknowledge what had happened, and they had dismissed it like it was nothing. A misunderstanding. A mistake to be brushed off. She had spent her entire career proving herself, making sure there was no room for doubt. She had flown through turbulence so rough it rattled the bones, landed planes in conditions that made lesser pilots hesitate, and handled emergencies with a kind of composure that earned respect. And still, none of that mattered in moments like today. As she walked toward the crew lounge, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from a fellow pilot, Rachel Torres. Rachel. Heard what happened. You good? Jada exhaled sharply, her fingers hovering over the screen before she replied. Jada. I'm fine. But this isn't over. Rachel's response came almost instantly. Rachel. Let me know how I can help. Jada stared at the message for a moment, then tucked her phone away. She had allies. She had people who saw what was happening, who knew that this wasn't just about one incident, it was about a culture that allowed this to keep happening. As she reached the lounge, she noticed a few crew members glance her way, some with curiosity, others with recognition. The story was already spreading. She wasn't sure how much they knew, but she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She grabbed a cup of coffee from the machine and sat down at one of the tables, forcing herself to take a breath. She needed a plan. If Whitaker wasn't going to take this seriously, she had to find another way to make them listen. That's when an idea formed. She reached for her phone again, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Daniel Carter, a journalist she had met a few years back when he was covering a story on diversity in aviation. He had always been one of the few willing to ask the tough questions, to dig into issues that others ignored. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Was she really going to do this? She thought about the moment at the counter, the way the staff had dismissed her, the way Whitaker had sighed like she was asking for too much. Yes, she was. She pressed the button and lifted the phone to her ear. Jada. Daniel's voice came through after a few rings. It's been a while. What's up? She took a deep breath. I have a story for you. There was a pause. Then, I'm listening. Jada glanced around the lounge, lowering her voice slightly. I was stopped at check-in today. They told me to wait outside because they didn't believe I was a pilot, even after I showed them my ID. Daniel let out a low whistle. That's not surprising. Unfortunately, Jada's grip tightened on the phone. It's not just about today. This is part of a bigger problem. And I'm done letting it slide. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, if you're serious about this, I can help. But you know what happens when stories like this go public. Are you ready for that? Jada exhaled. She had thought about it. The backlash. The scrutiny. The people who would say she was overreacting, that she should just move on. But this wasn't just about her. I'm ready, she said. Daniel didn't hesitate. Then let's do this. Jada ended the call, setting her phone down on the table. She had just lit a fuse. And soon, the entire airline was going to feel the explosion. Jada sat there for a moment, gripping the edge of the table. She had just set something in motion, and there was no turning back. The weight of what she had done settled in, but beneath it was something else. Determination. If the airline wasn't going to listen behind closed doors, she would make sure they had no choice but to listen in front of the world. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. But not from Rachel. It was from an unknown number. Unknown. Be careful what you're doing, Captain. Some things are better left alone. Jada frowned, her stomach tightening. Who was this? And how did they have her number? She glanced around the lounge, suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. Was someone watching her? She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could ignore it, act like she hadn't seen it. But that wasn't who she was. Jada, who is this? No response. She stared at the screen, waiting, but nothing else came through. The logical part of her knew it could be anything. A coincidence, a prank, maybe even someone from the airline trying to scare her into backing down. But something about it didn't sit right. Before she could think too much about it, Rachel walked into the lounge, her expression tense. She spotted Jada and made a beeline for her table. You really called Daniel? Rachel asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Jada nodded. Yeah, it's time. Rachel let out a low whistle, shaking her head. I hope you know what you're doing. You know how these companies are. They'll fight back. Jada's jaw tightened. Let them. Rachel hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Listen, I was talking to some of the other pilots. A few of them said they've seen this kind of thing happen before, but no one ever talks about it. Either they're afraid of retaliation, or they just don't think it'll change anything. Jada already knew that. It was part of the problem. The silence. The way people accepted things as just the way they were. But she wasn't going to be silent. Rachel lowered her voice. There's more. I overheard something in ops. The airline is already trying to get ahead of this. They're preparing a statement, calling it a miscommunication and an isolated incident. Jada felt her pulse quicken. They were already trying to shut it down before it even reached the public. Damage control. Spinning the story before she even had the chance to tell it herself. She exhaled, shaking her head. They think they can make this go away. Rachel nodded. And they will, unless you get ahead of them first. Jada's mind was already working, piecing things together. If the airline was moving fast, she had to move faster. She pulled out her phone and opened her email. Daniel had already sent a message. Daniel, let's set up an interview. I want to get your story on record before the company releases their statement. Let me know when you're ready. Jada's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She was ready. But before she could reply, another message came in. This time, it was from someone inside the airline. Insider. You don't know the whole story. Meet me. ASAP. Jada stared at the screen. The message was cryptic, but it was clear. Something bigger was happening behind the scenes. And whatever it was, she had just stepped right into the middle of it. Jada's pulse quickened as she stared at the message. An insider? Someone on the inside willing to talk? She didn't know if she could trust them, but she also knew she couldn't ignore this. She quickly typed back. Jada. Where? The reply came almost instantly. Insider. Parking garage. Level 3. 20 minutes. Jada locked her phone and stood up. Rachel watched her carefully. Where are you going? Rachel asked, her voice low. Jada hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Someone inside the airline just messaged me. They want to meet. Rachel's eyes widened. Are you sure that's a good idea? No, Jada admitted. But I need to know what they have to say. Rachel exhaled sharply, looking conflicted. Then I'm coming with you. Jada nodded, grateful for the backup. Together, they left the lounge, moving quickly through the terminal. The weight of what was happening sat heavy on Jada's chest. Every step felt like she was walking deeper into something she wasn't fully prepared for, but she had come too far to back down now. When they reached the parking garage, the air was thick with silence. The hum of engines in the distance, the occasional footstep echoing off the concrete. Jada scanned the area, her eyes landing on a figure standing near a pillar, partially in the shadows. The person stepped forward, a man in his late 50s, dressed in a crisp but slightly wrinkled airline uniform. Jada recognized him. Mark Evans. He was a senior operations manager, someone who had been with the airline for decades. You're the one who messaged me? Jada asked cautiously. Evans nodded, his expression tight. I don't have much time. I need you to listen. Rachel crossed her arms, clearly on guard. Why are you helping us? Evans sighed. Because this isn't just about what happened to you, Captain Williams. It's bigger than that. The airline has been covering up incidents like this for years. Jada's breath caught. What do you mean? Evans glanced around, lowering his voice. You're not the first pilot this has happened to. I've seen reports buried, complaints dismissed. They have a pattern. When something like this happens, they downplay it, shift the blame, and move on like nothing ever happened. Jada clenched her jaw. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach twist. Evans continued. But this time, they're nervous. They weren't expecting you to push back so hard. That's why they're scrambling to control the narrative. Rachel shook her head. So what happens now? They release their statement, deny everything, and keep doing the same thing. Evans hesitated. Not if you do something first. Jada frowned. What do you mean? Evans pulled out his phone, swiping through his emails. Then he turned the screen toward her. Jada's eyes widened. It was an internal memo from the airline's legal team. If Captain Williams goes public, we pivot. Isolate the incident. Call it a misunderstanding. Do not acknowledge systemic issues. Offer a non-apology if necessary, but avoid any language that suggests liability. Jada's hands curled into fists. It was all right there. Proof that they weren't just ignoring the problem. They were actively trying to manipulate the situation. This is what you needed, Evans said. If you want to expose them, this is your leverage. Jada took a deep breath. The final piece had just fallen into place. She looked at Rachel, then back at Evans. Send it to me. Evans nodded, forwarding the email. Be careful. Once this goes public, they won't hold back. Jada met his gaze. Neither will I. As she and Rachel walked back toward the terminal, Jada's phone buzzed again. A message from Daniel. Daniel, I just got a call from someone at the airline. They're trying to kill the story. But it's too late. Jada exhaled, her grip tightening on her phone. It was too late for them to hide the truth. And now, the whole world was about to know. Jada sat in the quiet of her car, her heart pounding as she stared at the forwarded email on her phone. It was the proof she needed. The airline had never planned to take real accountability. They had done this before, and they would keep doing it unless someone stopped them. And now, they had made the mistake of underestimating the wrong person. She forwarded the email to Daniel with a simple message. Jada, this changes everything. Let's go public now. Almost immediately, her phone rang. It was Daniel. She took a steadying breath and answered. You sure about this? He asked, his voice serious. Once this is out, there's no going back. Jada looked out the window, watching planes take off in the distance. She thought about all the pilots before her who had been silenced, about the ones who had been dismissed or ignored. And she thought about the young black girls who might dream of flying one day, who deserved a future where they wouldn't have to prove their worth just to exist in this space. I'm sure, she said. Daniel didn't waste any time. I'll publish the article in the next hour. It'll be everywhere. Jada hung up and exhaled. There was no fear now, only a deep, unwavering certainty. This was the right thing to do. Minutes later, her phone lit up with notifications. The article was live. The headline hit hard. Black pilot told to wait outside by airline staff. Company caught in internal cover-up. It spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, pilots and airline workers chiming in with their own experiences. Passengers, industry professionals, even activists started weighing in. The public was outraged, demanding answers. Then came the corporate response. The airline released a carefully crafted statement, claiming they were deeply sorry for the misunderstanding and committed to diversity and inclusion. But it was too late. The leaked internal memo was now public knowledge, exposing the truth behind their empty words. By the next morning, mainstream news outlets had picked up the story. Jada's inbox was flooded with interview requests. She hadn't planned to become the face of this fight, but now that she wasn't going to back down. She agreed to an interview with a major network. Sitting across from the anchor, she spoke clearly, confidently. This isn't just about me, Jada said. It's about a culture that allows these things to happen over and over again. It's about making sure the next generation of pilots, of all backgrounds, doesn't have to fight just to be seen as equal. The interview aired nationwide. Support poured in from pilots across the country, from advocacy groups, from passengers who vowed to hold airlines accountable. And then, the unexpected happened. The airline's CEO stepped down. Executives were forced to publicly acknowledge the internal failures that had been ignored for years. The company announced sweeping policy changes, including mandatory bias training and a third-party audit of their hiring and workplace culture. Jada watched it all unfold with a mix of satisfaction and relief. It wasn't just about one moment of discrimination anymore. It had sparked something bigger. Sitting in the cockpit of her next flight, she ran her hands over the controls, feeling the familiar sense of belonging she had always known in the air. This was her place. No one could take that from her. As the plane taxied to the runway, she glanced at her co-pilot, a young woman who had been following the news closely. "You ready?" Jada asked with a small smile. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with something Jada recognized: hope. Jada gripped the throttle and took a deep breath. "Let's fly."